Good morning all, and welcome to this morning's seminar on creating alternate growth media presented by the Office of the Queensland Mine Rehabilitation Commissioner in partnership with Wehr Ecological. My name's Sam Wildey, and it's a pleasure to have you all online today. We've had plenty of registration, so it's great to see such an awesome uptake. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners across the land on which we're meeting today and pay my respect to their elders past and present. Also, just a couple of housekeeping items to get to before I hand to today's MC. First of all, we are recording today's session, so it will be made available on our website after the session's completion. Please feel free to share that amongst your network or anyone who couldn't make it to today's session. We also hope to field as many questions as possible throughout the session. To lodge questions, there is a Q&A bubble at the top of your Teams screen. If you click on that, you can pose questions to our team or the presenters. They will disappear for a period of time. However, our team will receive all of them, and then we'll get through as many as we can, or as many time permits. So with that all squared away, it's now my pleasure to hand over to today's MC, our lead technical officer, Louisa Nicholson. Over to you, Louisa.
Thanks, Sam, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you online and join us today. Most of you may be aware of the role of our office, but for those who aren't, one of our key functions is to produce technical reports regarding leading practice rehabilitation. And one such topic which we're speaking of today is addressing topsoil deficits. So the purpose of our seminars is to discuss recent publications, and in today it will be on creating alternate growth media to achieve successful revegetation on Queensland mines. These seminars give us the opportunity to highlight the work that our technical experts produce, but also allows you to hear from the authors and ask questions as we have discussions throughout this morning. So please get your fingers ready to type some questions into the Q&A section. In a moment, I'm going to present our presenters for today. But before I do that, it's important for us to reflect on the fact that it takes a lot of time and input from authors to develop these technical products, but we also rely on the assistance of many others. For example, key stakeholders help us to develop the scope of projects to ensure that we focus on the most relevant technical matters, but also during the development of these papers, we receive a lot of valuable input from other content experts who do peer reviews for us. And so the authors and I today wanted to publicly acknowledge the contributions of Brad Radloff, Andrew Bauer, Thomas Baumgartel, and other Wehr colleagues. So thank you very much to all who contributed to this work. So moving along, I think we'll introduce our presenters for today. And firstly, we have Dr. Bernhard Wehr with us online. Bernhard is a certified professional soil scientist. He is the principal soil scientist and sector lead for mining and energy at Wehr Ecological Engineering. Bernhard has over 20 years experience in soil science, land rehab and environmental management. And with a PhD in soil science and a background in biochemistry and horticulture, Bernhard brought a deep expertise in managing soil constraints across mine sites and degraded landscapes to help us deliver the resilient environmental outcomes that we need for industry. Dr. Glenn Dale is the main presenter for today, and Glenn is the Managing Director and Chief Technical Officer at Wehr Ecological Engineering. Glenn holds a Bachelor of Science in Forestry and Biochemistry, a PhD in Molecular and Quantitative Genetics, and an MBA. Glenn also has appointments as Adjunct Associate Professor with the University of Southern Queensland and QUT. Glenn brings 40 years of practical experience to this work and works across a variety of sectors, both domestically and internationally. So welcome, Bernhard and Glenn. So I might just hand over to Glenn and look forward to the presentation this morning, Glenn. Thanks.
Thanks, Louisa, and thanks for everyone attending. Great to have such interest in this topic. And thanks for the Office of Mine Rehab Commissioner for promoting this work, because we're very well aware that it's a major issue in industry. So originally, both Bernhard and I were presenting this, but Bernhard's in a remote area at the moment. So unfortunately, you've got me for most of the seminar, and Bernhard will be available for questions. We'll move through. I'll start off with a bit of a context, and we'll talk about why we need to create growth media, characteristics of growth media, topsoil and subsoil, doesn't matter, and then look at how we go about ameliorating medium that we have available to create a soil, and identifying constraints, and then the importance of trials. So we'll have a couple of stop points during the presentation where we can catch up on questions for each section. So with that, I'll get started. So this might seem a funny slide to start talking about creating growth media for mine rehab. But this is a photo of the Dust Bowl in the US in the 1930s, and it was a major impact on US agriculture, but it really came about because farming practice didn't understand soil ecology, and that's a really key theme throughout all of the discussion today. What we're really trying to do is recreate a self-sustaining soil ecology and understanding the factors that lead to that. A positive out of the Dust Bowl in the US was it was the impetus for development of the RUSLE, which I'm sure most people will be familiar with. And the RUSLE is actually portrayed as possibly one of the biggest science experiments in history. It was an enormous amount of data collected over a very long period of time. But we tend to think of the USLE in terms of estimating erosion, estimating soil loss, but it's also a fantastic guide for rehabilitating soils as well. And I guess ignoring the parameters that go into it, the structure of the RUSLE is very important in terms of erosion is a function of energy input, the R factor, which is what we have to deal with. We can't change that, but also a function of soil physical and to some degree chemical properties, slope length, practice control factors, and crop management. A lot of the work we're presenting today comes out of a few long-term ACARP projects that we ran from over about 8 years, from 2014 2022. And at the very start of that ACARP work, we looked at successful and unsuccessful rehab on a whole range of mine sites in Queensland. And what we found was a very strong focus on landform, on slope lengths, on slope length. We've actually added a factor in here, slope shape, not so much concentration on that. Reasonable concentration on practice control factors in terms of creating waterways, contours, but very minimal emphasis on dealing with soil physical constraints and creating a soil that could support healthy crop growth. And I guess if there's a couple of key takeaway messages from today, but one really key message is if we're not focusing on all of the factors here, not thinking about those, all factors in rehab design, soil amelioration, then we might get away with a successful site where the soil is very benign, But where we're dealing with difficult soils or no soil, then can almost certainly guarantee failure. So a lot of the discussion today will be around how do we ameliorate and manage and design topsoils to address issues with the K factor, and particularly the C factor in the RUSLE. Again, probably a slide here that is a bit unusual for a mine rehab site. This is not a mine rehab. This is an alluvial gully on grazing land that we've worked on in the Burdekin. Some of you may know the Burdekin, or three small subcatchments of the Burdekin contribute 25% of the total fine sediment that is lost to the reef every year, and has a major impact on reef health. So there's quite a lot of focus on rehabilitating those the Bowen Broken Bogey catchments, but a lot of similar issues. Highly sodic soils in this case. Topsoil is long gone. A lot of this topsoil went 80 years ago, and in some cases we can find it a bit of it left a kilometre downstream, but dealing with no topsoil, and after rehabilitation, there's a reference hill in the background here. This is now a stable, self-sustaining site. It's been monitored every year since the rehabilitation in 2018, and the resilience of this site is actually improving every year since that site. So I guess just a demonstration that when you're dealing with highly hostile soils, no topsoil to start with, it is possible to achieve rehab. And similarly, just to put this into a mining context, this is a trial site that was established as part of the ACART projects we talked about earlier. As many of you will know, dealing with sodic soils in the Bowen Basin, rock mulches is often or has in the past been specified in closure criteria. This trial actually compares rock mulch, which is this treatment and this treatment, to a range of soil amelioration treatments, and not just soil and spoil, underlying spoil treatment. And this trial passed what I call the intraocular trauma test. We didn't need statistics to tell us that soil loss was much greater on the rock mulch sites than it was on the the well ameliorated sites, and the sites that were designed with the to minimize erosion. And again, the principles behind this were addressing all the factors in the RUSLE. So to get onto the core of the presentation, why are we creating growth media in the first place? And growth media is quite specifically used because we are dealing in situations where there is no topsoil available. We're dealing with hostile soils, or it might be old topsoils that have been poorly looked after and have lost their health, or stripping hasn't been able to remove sufficient material in the first place. And in these cases, and dealing with hostile subsoils as well, where putting a good quality, a thin veneer of good quality topsoil over a hostile subsoil is not likely to give good long-term results. And the challenge in mining is dealing with the scale of the problem. If we're dealing with rehabilitation of the road verge, for instance, on a freeway, relatively small areas, you can create, bring in materials and create very high performing soils, but it's difficult to do that at scale in mining rehab, where you're lacking good topsoil in the first place. So it really requires the ability to work with what you have available, ameliorate that, and get it to the point that you can put it on a trajectory to becoming a soil over time. So I guess since the green revolution in agriculture, there's been a huge amount of work in dealing with the chemical limitations of soil, and particularly nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. But soil is, there's a major distinction between soil and dirt, and soil is really a living organism in a way. We need to really consider not just the chemical properties, but the physical and the biological properties. Soil has soil needs to function, to be able to support plant growth. It has a number of really key important functions, more than simply just providing nutrients, but being able to store water, being able to allow oxygen to penetrate to maintain root growth, not being so dense due to compaction that you have physical restrictions on root penetration. So all of these factors need to be considered, and there is growing realization that soil biology is just as important as soil chemistry. I guess and coming back to the experience with working across a lot of mine sites, very, very commonly, and I guess, and relating it back to the RUSLE, commonly we'll see a recipe-based approach to dealing with topsoil amelioration, and if I had $1 for every time I've heard someone say, well, we're going to put on 200 kgs of DAP a hectare, we really need to understand the characteristics of the soil that we're dealing with and design an amelioration, and simply adding nutrients is ignoring other key physical and biological properties. So I guess the point we can't emphasize enough, the biological function of topsoil in particular is what distinguishes it from simply dirt or any other media that plants can potentially grow in. That biological function of soil microbes, microflora, fungi, bacteria, microfauna is fragile, and that's the reason for how I guess guidelines around the management of topsoil stockpiles. A topsoil stockpile made too high, stored for too long, allowed to grow a high density of weeds, can lose its biological function over time and convert from being soil back into dirt, to lose that biological function, which is important for aggregation of soil particles that provide soil structure. It's important for mineralization of nutrients, both from the mineral properties of the soil, but also from the organic matter in the soil. So maintaining that biological function is key when you have topsoil, and re-establishing the biological function is critical to think of when you're trying to create a new soil media. Chemical properties, as I mentioned, I guess was where a lot of focus has been since the Green Revolution, with the development of mineral fertilizers, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers. They can be easily manipulated. But even still, I guess, and again from experience, having a good soil analysis and spatially representative soil analysis is really key to ameliorating and chemical properties. So I guess, and again from experience, we've seen a lot of sites, particularly in the Bowen Basin, where the micronutrients are just as important, or a deficiency in micronutrients is just as important as the macronutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. And if you're not working based on what the soil is telling you, if you're working on a recipe rather than what the soil is telling you, then it's difficult to achieve successful rehabilitation. Physical properties of the soil, again, more difficult to measure. I guess requires a bit more experience, and some of the physical properties can't be changed. So we have to work generally with the texture that we have. As most people will know, texture is defined by the combination of sand, silt, and clay. At scale, very, very difficult to change. And again, it could be changed in a main road setting on the side of a road, but difficult to change at scale. And once you start mixing different materials, it can have unexpected results. While it's very difficult to change texture of soil, other physical properties can be managed, and in particular, and we'll talk about it in a bit, dispersive soils are, I guess, a special case in point where the energy that leads to erosion is actually not coming through rainfall; it's coming through the ionic repulsion between particles. And so it is possible with sodic soils to change the physical properties by manipulating, by adding calcium to offset the effects of sodium, and restore soil structure and soil permeability. The other way that physical properties can be affected is through aggregate formation, and again it comes back to this very complex interaction between chemical, physical, biological properties. Organic matter and soil, the microflora, microfauna are responsible for improving the aggregation of soil particles and improving soil structure. So encouraging and re-establishing that biological function is a key part of managing soil physical properties. So I guess talked a little bit about this already. Soil functionality, and it's really important that we think of soil in terms of how it functions, how soil, vegetation, and water interact with each other in designing a strategy to create a growth media. And I guess what this means is that we can convert spoil into soil if we understand the characteristics of what we're starting with and the end point of where we want to get to. And of course, we are in a situation where our only option is to try to create a growing media from spoil. We can recreate that relatively quickly when it's very difficult to create from when we're just lacking soil in the first place. And understanding the mineral fraction, the mineralogy of the soil that we're dealing with, and the organic matter is really critical, and an often overlooked part of moving soil along that trajectory. So just to conceptualize that change. Spoil is generally a fairly inert mineral material, and by adding ameliorants like nitrogen, phosphorus, organic matter, we're incorporating those into the soil as an additive, and over time, the phosphorus will bind to the clay fraction. Nitrogen will be incorporated into organic matter in the soil, and the aim is really to kickstart, restart soil ecology in a way that it can build its own organic matter over time. Initially, the mulch that we add on will mineralize, will break down, will release nutrients, and effectively feed, if you like, or fertilize the soil microflora. It's providing the carbon that the soil microbiology needs to function. And I guess there's a lot of products on the market that purport to re-establish soil microbiology, but in all cases, in the absence of a carbon source, there's effectively no food for soil microbiology to function. So it's very important to think of how to really kickstart that process in a way that gets organic matter mineralization going, allows soil microbiology to re-establish, which then allows plants to grow, and as plants grow and roots continually cycle, roots die, litters redeposited into the soil, the organic matter builds up over time. And really what we're trying to do in mine rehab is move this along this trajectory sufficiently to allow the system to become self-sustaining. If we had a 1,000-year view of things, this trajectory would happen naturally, but allowing 1,000 years for these processes to re-establish is not an option. So we'll just pause at this point and open the floor to questions.
Thanks, Glenn. So we're off to a good start. We have one question here, which if Bernhard, if you're willing to answer, otherwise Glenn can pick it up. But just reflecting back on one of your earlier slides about the biological activity of, making topsoil and soil and amended spoil, not dirt. Are there some important things we can do to maintain that biological activity of stockpiled material? We often hear about stockpiling topsoil, which, sometimes has to happen, and the problems that are associated with doing that for long periods of time. So just wondering if there's some important things we can do to maintain the biological activity of that material as it sits in a stockpile.
Want to go first, Glenn?
Yep, way you go, Bud.
Well, firstly, I have seen stockpiles that are 20 meters tall. That is more a mountain and not a soil. So clearly the importance would be to keep your stockpiles relatively low. I know that has got certain limitations in terms of space available, but essentially, even if you're trying to maintain aeration inside a stockpile, it's still not going to be nearly as useful as having a shallow stockpile where you've got roots growing into the soil and actually maintaining that organic matter addition. So if you don't have that nutrient input, once the organic matter sources have been used, the biological activity goes down rather significantly.
Thanks, Bernhard. I think we had a little bit of sound issues there, but I feel you were saying keep your stockpiles low in height and keep your organic matter in those stockpiles to help keep the biological activity happening. I'm assuming, Glenn, pull me up if I got that wrong.
No, correct, Louisa. And really, you can think of it in terms of availability of water and oxygen in the stockpile and inorganic matter. So stockpiles that are created too high will become anoxic at depth, and the biological activity is lost. And I guess in a ideal situation, you want to be preserving that that biological function in topsoil stockpiles. Once it's lost, then effort's got to be put in to recreate that biological function, and it can lead to a range of other issues as well. But I guess, as everyone knows, in a perfect scenario, the ideal is to pick the topsoil up from here and replace it directly over here. But often, mine design, and I guess that's an issue, a bigger issue that we need to think of in terms of how rehabilitation specialists interact with mine planners. And there are certainly examples where in Australia and in coal mining where that is achieved, where the design of mining allows immediate replacement of or very, very short periods of stockpiling at worst, but early replacement of topsoil and preservation of its biological function. But where that's not possible, managing stockpiles to maintain the permeability, the ability of oxygen and water to infiltrate and to maintain the biological function is important. And the higher you make stockpiles, the less likely that's achieved at the base of the stockpile.
That's great advice. We have a follow-up question just to wrap this little question and discussion section up, and that is from Lisa, and it's what kind of time frame are we looking at for mulch or fertilizer to develop biological activity? So assuming there's a bit of a lag before that material is incorporated and active. So do we have any sort of time frames that are generalized or realistic, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's difficult to put a number on it. But I guess in both those examples that I showed you, with the alluvial gully and the spoil dump rehabilitation, that process effectively started within, very, very quickly, within 6 months. Both sites were, and on lots of other sites, I guess, and even shorter, have got to the point their vegetation is re-established, it's healthy, and that succession of vegetation as well has started. So it's not just a succession of soil type, I guess, it's a succession of vegetation, of often, of course, starting with cover crops that establish very quickly but die, but in the process start to put organic matter back into the soil, and then slower establishing pasture species and native species establish slower, and as they establish, then they build more biomass, which then puts more organic matter back into the soil. So I guess probably the best numbers we actually have is from some of the gully rehabilitation. It's been harder to get good numbers from mine rehab work, but we've seen gullies within and been monitored over quite a period of time go from around 88% effectiveness at the first assessment, which was a couple of months after rehabilitation, to getting up to 97% effectiveness on that particular one that I showed you, which is actually the oldest one, at about about 8 years after rehabilitation. So get it right, and I guess the important thing is getting onto that trajectory and getting the system function re-established and the soil ecology functioning again quickly.
That's great, thank you. Just goes to show that natural processes don't really go to plan sometimes, and we need to give them time and the right conditions, I suppose, to get going. We might continue moving on, Glenn, if you've had a little bit of a break there before we charge back into the next section.
Rightio, keep going. Okay, topsoil, subsoil, doesn't matter. In this diagram on the right here, we're looking at a gradational soil, and the boundary between where topsoil stops and subsoil starts is not clear, and topsoil is, in lots of ways, it's a really interesting thing. If you try and Google a definition of topsoil, it's really hard to get a really clear definition of what it is. But ultimately, it's the part of the soil profile that does have biological activity in it, that has higher organic matter content as a result of that biological activity. It's where there is a seed bank. So I guess in rehab, trying to define the depth of that topsoil is quite important in terms of specifying stripping depth, and it really is a valuable resource. And where it can be preserved, then it's really important to try to preserve it as much as possible. On the other hand, subsoil, the BC horizons, are generally fairly low in organic carbon. They will have organic carbon because roots should be penetrating into the subsoil, and you can see low down in the image there, roots at quite a depth. So it is contributing some organic matter into the profile. Generally, there's no seed bank, and I'm sure everyone's seen the case on just even on native soils where the topsoil is stripped for whatever reason. There's a slip, a bit of erosion. Subsoil is very, even where it's not hostile, very slow to re-establish. Conversely, Queensland is blessed with the fact that probably some of the worst soils that God ever created, and there is a very high frequency of saline, dispersive, and hostile subsoils, and that's a function of the old geology of Australia. So very small amounts of salt coming in on rainfall, even in inland areas over millennia, builds up sodium in the soil and salt in the soil. So large, massive areas of Queensland in particular of sodic soils, and across Australia of saline soils if they're not managed well. However, subsoil, I guess the last point is quite relevant here. Soil isn't actually a requirement to grow plants per se, and the whole idea of hydroponics is providing oxygen, providing nutrients to plants, and not obstructing root growth through the physical properties of a liquid media. Have no restrictions, no physical restriction on root growth, and you can grow very healthy plants very comfortably. So subsoil in its own right can be ameliorated, but again, and I guess the other key message of today, in addition to addressing all the elements of the RUSLE, is characterising what you're working with. Once you've characterised what you have available, then it's possible to design an amelioration strategy that addresses that physical, biological, chemical properties to create a media that can support plant growth. And that becomes more important when you do have hostile conditions like salinity and dispersion. So creating, I guess I got ahead of myself again a bit here, creating a growth medium, a couple of approaches. Look at reference analog sites, but also look at the depth, the physical properties of the soil, but also we need to consider what the post-mining land use is. So it's around, in designing an amelioration strategy, it should be a strategy that is fit for purpose. I guess for those of you who aren't familiar, and I don't know if people can see this, but what we call the Brown Book from CSIRO, interpreting soil test results. What do all the numbers mean? Is an incredibly valuable reference that you'll continue to use in interpreting what the analysis of soil physical, chemical, biological properties you have, and how you design an amelioration strategy. In terms of that strategy being designed as fit for purpose, if you're looking at a post-mining land use, say grazing or agriculture production systems, they will need greater inputs than a native forest system. As some of you might remember Chris Moran from who headed up Sustainable Minerals Institute for a while, and Chris stood up in front of a Soil Science Society meeting many years ago, and he said in the way that he does, the only difference between mining and agriculture is that agriculture is slow mining. And he's dead right. Any production system is removing nutrients, it's removing organic matter out of the system. And some of that may be replaced by mineralization of nutrients in the soil, but where it's not replaced through that process, then those inputs need to be replaced through fertilizers and even, I guess there's growing recognition and in agriculture, even of the need to replace or manage to replace organic matter losses. If we look at, and again, I guess the analogy is instructive. If we look at agricultural soils worldwide, the average soil organic carbon content has declined from about 2% to 1%. Which doesn't sound a lot, but effectively it's a 50% loss in carbon. And so from a production point of view, that's winding down the capital value of the soil. So managing to either rebuild that carbon or to maintain that carbon is important in any production system, and equally important if the production system post-mining is grazing, is pasture, is cropping, or any other land use. And of course, it's important that if it's producing food crops, producing animals for human consumption, that there are no toxic materials. So I guess, and these can be materials at low concentrations, such as, selenium is critically important for animal growth up to a certain concentration, and beyond that it becomes toxic. And so again, characterizing what you're working with, understanding and designing for purpose is really important. On the other hand, if post-mining land use is a native woodland, it becomes a self-supporting system over time. There's no removals from the system, so nutrients that are put in are going into biomass, being lost as debris, coming back and being recycled in the soil. And so in this case, the design for amelioration is around kick-starting the system, getting enough nutrients, enough organic matter, enough biological function back in the soil to allow it to get started and then get onto its own trajectory. I guess a really important point here is that native systems, the analog system, or using native systems as analog, often soils are low in phosphorus, they're low in nitrogen, and it's probably a case where it is important to be careful of using analogs, because some of those applied nutrients will be lost out of the system in any case. So the initial amelioration needs to be sufficient to get vegetation established quickly. The quicker you can establish vegetation, and particularly ground cover, the quicker the resilience of the site will improve, that fine sediment loss will be reduced, and any inputs are maintained on the site and get into a cycling phase. And with where you're looking at something like a post-mining land use, it is a dynamic system. I guess everything we're talking about here really is ecological engineering, where we're providing the conditions to allow the system to organize itself, and so I guess we're guiding where it's going. We're not directing where it's going per se, in terms of that trajectory from bare rehab to a native woodland, if that's the final land use. Okay, we'll have another quick break for questions.
Sure. We have a number of questions, and thank you to everyone who's contributing. I've held off a few of those because they really are going to be relevant for the slides coming up that Glenn will be speaking to. In the meanwhile, we have another question. Talking earlier about the subsoil sort of layers, particularly in these formed landforms that we're creating in mine rehabilitation. Just wondering, how deep down should we assess whether subsoil material is suitable, that is not hostile for plant growth?
Really good question, and it will come up in the next set of slides.
It's hard.
Yeah, so I guess just to answer that, and again, coming back to think of it in terms of the RUSLE, in terms of both the K and the C factor, the soil physical properties and the ability to grow a crop. And I guess an early comment about putting a thin layer of topsoil over a subsoil. The soil profile is itself quite a complex functional unit. While plants might pick up a lot of the nutrients out of the topsoil, they need to be able to penetrate their roots to depth in the subsoil, both, and obviously for trees for physical stability, but to tap the volume of water. So this will come into some of the slides in a second in terms of plant available water holding. Water holding might vary anywhere between 60 millimeters, providing water can get into the soil, 60 millimeters per meter depth of soil to 220, 240 millimeters per depth of soil. So two soil profiles of the same depth, let's say they're both a meter, one that's holding 60 mils of water and one that's holding 220 mils of water, are going to perform very differently. So that combination of depth and water holding, the greater the depth and the greater the water holding, the rate of the biomass that site can support. So look, I guess as a number, a minimum depth of 80 centimeters to even probably really minimum 60 is pretty marginal, but ideally at least a meter and ideally 1.5 meters to 2 meters of profile in which plant roots can grow is ideal, and we'll talk about some of the strategies for managing that in a second.
Thanks. Bernhard, I don't know if you had anything to add there, but that seems to be related very much to the rooting depth of the vegetation that you're going to be growing.
Yes, certainly that is one consideration, and the other one is really the answer here is how long is a piece of string. So it is really difficult to give a hard and fast rule how deep the root medium should be, but the deeper you can do it, the better it probably will be. So if you have got a choice between 60 centimeters and 100 centimeters, go for the 100 centimeters.
Lovely, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we might keep rolling on just to keep, because we have got some other questions on the sidelines ready to go after the next section. Thanks, Glenn.
Yeah, just one minor additional thought. We try to avoid getting involved in environmental court cases, but I got sucked in years ago to one. It was a quarry that was rehabilitating benches, hard rock benches, and they had planned to put 10 centimeters of topsoil and grow trees on it, and you can that amount of topsoil, even if you had 100 mils of water per meter, would store about 10 mils of water, which is about a day's water supply for the trees. The chance of, I guess it's an extreme example, but the chance of growing trees on 10 centimeters of soil is two chances, Buckley's and none. So it is around that mixture of depth and fertility. Okay. I guess getting on to the nitty-gritty end of the paper in terms of identifying and ameliorating soil constraints, and we've just had that discussion. I guess another outcome of that, the ACARP, the review we did at the start of the ACARP work years ago, a lot of focus on topsoil and very little focus on spoil, and what we're I guess we need to not think of it as topsoil and spoil, but trying to recreate a soil profile, a functional soil profile. So managing both of those is very important, and it does require characterizing the whole raft of chemical, physical, physicochemical, and biological properties. And we'll just run through a few key ones here, pH through to organic matter. So, and I guess understanding what you're characterizing is important as well. So again, for anyone who isn't aware, and I don't know if people can see that, but one of the other Bibles of soil science, Soil Chemical Methods by Raymond and Lyons, which is again what we call the Green Book, another CSIRO publication. It's really important to understand what the chemical tests that you're getting done mean. So pH measured in calcium chloride or water will give very different results. And if you're making a decision on one and think you're making a decision, if you're getting analysis for one and making a decision using the other as a reference scale, then you may have some issues. And as I'm sure many people may know, pH is a log scale. At low pH, you can have issues like aluminium toxicity, low availability of P. At high pH, we can have trace element deficiency and again deficiency of P. At high pH, you can have in alkaline soils, you can have what appears to be a contradictory scenario where there might actually be a lot of calcium, but not much of that calcium is available because it precipitates out and moves into insoluble forms. So pH is, I guess, it's often measured, but not often really explicitly considered in design of amelioration. But it is very important. And in that, Goldilocks range, so to speak, in pH water between that 5.5 to 7, 8.5. Plant nutrients are available, and different nutrients will become available, indoor toxic, as you move into more acid soils or more alkaline soils. So obviously low pH soils can be ameliorated by addition of calcium, lime, bringing up the calcium concentration. High pH soils can be ameliorated by using sulfur or materials like sulfur bentonite, which stimulate soil microbial activity to increase the acidity and reduce the pH. And reducing pH is not something that we've seen is very common in practice on mine sites, but it is an important consideration if you're dealing with extreme pH values. And no matter how much nutrient you put on, you're still going to be having an induced deficiencies if you're outside the Goldilocks range. Dispersion, there's an estimate that roughly half the soils in the Bowen Basin are dispersive, and from an industry point of view, a really rough estimate is that actually represents about a $2 billion liability in rehabilitation, in additional cost of rehabilitation. So it really is a significant problem, and it's one of the major constraints to achieving successful rehabilitation. You can, and it's one of the easiest things to determine in the field, and simply popping a couple of soil aggregates into ideally into distilled water, you'll see almost immediately if it's dispersive, it'll form a cloud. If the soil is stable, it will remain clear. So, and I guess again, coming back to the USLE, the energy, dispersive soils will actually erode in still water. They don't need heavy rainfall. They don't need high flow velocities. The energy is actually coming from the fact that a high proportion of sodium ions, which have got a large electron shell, and when the soil is moistened, it loses strength. The particles actually push each other apart, and that's how tunnel erosion forms, as an example. So really easy to test in the field, and really instructive, and particularly when you get some soils will actually explode when you put them into water. So dispersion, in terms of a lab test, dispersion's often measured in terms of ESP, exchangeable sodium percentage. It can be an indicator, and I guess most textbooks will say less than about an ESP of 6%, a non-sodic 6 to around 15% are sodic, and above that they're highly sodic and highly dispersive. It is an indication, but it's not the entire indication, and we'll get onto a slide in a second just to explain that in a bit more detail. Salt in the soil, salinity is bad in terms of plant growth, but it can actually counteract the physical effects of dispersion, and getting the balance right. Again, salinity is a continuum. There's no hard and fast cutoff. Plants will have a threshold at which salt will start to affect them, and then they will decline in growth above that up to a certain point beyond which they won't grow. But I guess we've seen examples where people have applied very hard cutoffs for salinity, and not use topsoil resources that could have been ameliorated and well managed. The salt can be leached out of those soils, and they can actually be quite useful. The treatment for dispersion is to increase calcium through gypsum application, because generally dispersive soils are high pH, so you don't want to increase the pH with lime. You want to increase the calcium content without increasing the pH, and gypsum. In fact, gypsum, there is some recent research that indicates gypsum will actually reduce the pH a little bit as well, which is beneficial. But you need rainfall to activate the gypsum for that calcium to exchange with sodium on the clay, cation exchange of the clay fraction of the soil. I've seen sites where people have said to me, gypsum doesn't work in mining. Chemistry is chemistry, whether it's agriculture or mining. And what they were really describing is they applied gypsum, had really heavy rainfall the next day or the next week before the gypsum had done its thing by exchanging on the cation exchange complex, and got erosion. It wasn't because the gypsum hadn't worked. It was that it hadn't had time. There hadn't been moisture in the soil to allow it to exchange. And the required rate of gypsum can easily be calculated from soil chemistry. We've talked a little bit about salinity already. Really easy to measure as well. It can be done in the field, equally easy in the lab. Normally it's measured as a 1 to 5 suspension in water, and then converted to what's called an EC of which is the electrical conductivity of a saturated extract. that just brings it to a number that can be used to look at across different soil types of the potential effect of salinity on plants of differing salt tolerance. So it provides a universal number in that sense, or a universal reference. The thing about salt in the soil is it's highly mobile, and Australia has around about 17 million hectares of agricultural land that's affected by salinity. It wasn't always saline. A lot of that land, we've changed the hydrology, we've removed native vegetation, which allows, as a really generic average, under native vegetation, you might get 5 mils of deep drainage a year. Under crops, you might get 50 mils of deep drainage a year. So if we have a really simple number, if you've got 50 mils of deep drainage and a porosity of 30%, then you're actually going to increase the water table by 150 mils each year. So keep doing that for 50, 100 years and the water table rises. And once the water table rises, it brings salt back up, dissolves salt and brings it back up to the surface. So again, understanding not just the properties of soil, but the properties of the landscape that you're working in as well. And designing in a way that you're able to promote flushing down the profile of salt. The salt deep in the profile below the root zone it's not an issue. And again, coming back to the trials I showed right at the start on the rehabilitated spoil dump, were actually one of the best examples I've actually seen in mine rehab, where we actually achieved extremely significant flushing of salt down the profile within 1 to 2 years of rehabilitation there, because we re-established permeability of the soil throughout the whole profile and allowed salt to move down. So the salinity sedicity story is a really important one, and particularly again for Queensland soils. These curves represent what's called the threshold electrolyte concentration, and it's the point. So this is for a generic relationship for soils of different clay content, but it's the point at which, due to dispersion, a soil loses 80% of its permeability. So if we're in this part of the curve here, I'm not sure if people can see my mouse, but the top left corner of the curve, we've got very low electrical conductivity, but a high sodium absorption ratio, or you can read that as exchangeable sodium percentage. And soils will disperse to the point that they've lost greater than 80% of their permeability. Down in the bottom right of the corner, soil is maintaining its permeability. So there is this interaction between the two. We don't want to get too high on the salinity curve, or salt will become toxic to plants. And equally, you don't want to get too high on the exchangeable sodium percentage, or SAR, or soil structure will be destroyed and plants won't grow for a whole range of reasons. But this graph is really important in terms of designing amelioration of subsoils in particular. It's equally important for topsoils, but I guess in practice, we've found it really important for subsoils, from the point of view that if you use the simple 5%, 6% ESP number, you've got to put so much gypsum on to make the soil non-sodic that it becomes impractical. And it might be perfectly, and I guess we've seen a lot of cases, it might be perfectly tolerable to have a subsoil ESP of 15%, just as an example, where you're only sitting at around 2 decisiemens, and most native vegetation will easily tolerate 2 decisiemens of salinity. But in that range, if you're on a 25 to 30, using this particular graph, 25 to 30% clay soil, it will be stable. The plants will tolerate the level of salinity, and you won't have erosion. And the amount of gypsum that needs to be applied to bring it to that level is a practical amount. So amelioration of spoil prior to application of topsoil to create a permeable, non-hostile subsoil. This graph is a really critical element. And in doing that, improving the structure of both the topsoil and the subsoil improves the ability of soil to hold water for 2 reasons, and I'll probably get ahead of myself on the next slide. The first is if water doesn't get into the soil in the first place, then it can't hold water. But once it does get in beyond the top centimetre, it has to be able to permeate to depth to be able to be stored. So again, we can't change the clay mineralogy easily, but by increasing increasing organic matter itself doesn't directly affect the plant water holding capacity, but by changing the structure, it improves the ability of water to infiltrate and store water. And coming back to the earlier question, for a given soil water holding capacity, increasing depth will increase available soil water. So if your plant available water holding capacity is, let's say it's 100 mils per metre depth, if you can create 2 metres of growing media, then automatically you're holding 200 metres of depth. But if you've only got 50 centimetres, then you're only storing 50 millimetres of water. And the ability to sustain some a native vegetation system, a native woodland on 50 centimetres of soil of 50 mils of water, if it's that 100 mils per metre, is going to be very marginal. You will have drought deaths.
Glenn, sorry, just to interrupt you, I'm very apologetic about this. We've only got like about no more than 10 minutes left before we have to throw out to final questions. I just thought I'd remind you of that. Thank you.
No, very good. I think we're pretty close now.
Thanks.
So, talking too much here. Okay, and so again, minimising compaction, limiting runoff, and storing soil in the water in the soil is important. I saw a paper years ago of a mine rehab paper where someone had the realisation that a store and release cover was similar to a soil profile, and that's exactly what we're trying to achieve. The functions of storing water and then re-releasing it through transpiration. Identifying or characterizing the nutrients that are in the I guess this is most people will be familiar with this. Most agronomic soil analyses will generally limit themselves to this part and identify what the limitations are, what any toxicities are. But again, coming back to the book on interpreting soil analysis, what all the numbers mean is a really invaluable guide to determining what your nutrient amelioration strategy needs to be. And again, it's not just the macronutrients NPK and S, but micronutrients can be equally important in achieving a functional soil or a healthy soil that will support plant growth. And I guess we've touched on infiltration rate. We can have the best plant available water capacity in the soil possible, but if the surface soil is such that it seals and doesn't allow rainfall to infiltrate, then that water doesn't get into the soil. So maintaining good structure at the surface. Deep-rooted plants will create channels, root channels, and promote infiltration. And again, it's that concept of, I guess, environmental engineering design of watershedding. It might be mechanically stable, but doesn't allow water to infiltrate and be re-released through transpiration, which is really what we're trying to achieve. And organic matter, I guess the third takeaway from today is we can't underestimate the importance of organic matter. And when we're dealing with trying to create a topsoil and there is no organic matter, we haven't got topsoil stockpiles, then putting organic matter back in to start that that transition process, to kick it off, to provide the energy to get initial colonies of soil microbes or microflora functioning is really important. I guess an important consideration here is understanding not organic matter is the same. And I guess, we were looking at some analyses recently for 2 different organic matter sources. I forget the exact numbers, but one had, let's say it was 50% organic carbon, the other had 25% organic carbon. So effectively, you could pay twice as much for the one with 50% organic carbon that you pay for the one with 25%, because you're getting, it's the organic carbon component of organic matter that is important. And that, that depends on the source of material that you're working with. And of course, by re-establishing the function of soil through plants and root leaf debris turnover, you're effectively converting sunlight into organic matter and building that up over time. I've talked about considering the type of organic matter material and that you're putting on, but we should be aiming for somewhere between about 24 to 30, a ratio of carbon to nitrogen of 24 to 30 to 1. Above that ratio, then the soil microbes are actually going to use up all the available nitrogen trying to break down the carbon. Below that ratio, you have an excess of nitrogen which can be lost to leaching. So again, there is a Goldilocks zone that you need to be aiming for there, both in terms of what's in the soil, but also in terms of the quality of the organic matter that you're applying. A couple of sources of organic matter: biosolids, composted manure, composted green waste. Wood chips might be good for improving soil structure by creating large particles, but they've got a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio, and they can actually induce a nutrient deficiency because the soil microbes will outcompete plants for available nitrogen. Okay, so just in terms of an approach, and this is in the paper, there's a process to work. I won't go through this in detail, but I guess a process to work through in terms of analysing the soil physical properties, the chemical properties, the biological properties, the physicochemical properties, those chemical properties that have an effect on the physical structure, and the physical properties that have an effect on the chemical structure of soil, and working through those and designing an amelioration strategy that is fit for purpose in terms of what you're starting with, what you're trying to get to, and what the post-mining land use is. And I guess that's the other take-home message from this paper. And I guess finally, just to wrap up, there's a saying that soil science is not rocket science; it's harder. And there are just multiple interactions between physical, chemical, biological properties. So it's invaluable, even with the best designed amelioration strategy. It's still valuable to implement trials, and both from a proof point of view, but also from a learning point of view in terms of how far you can push the system either side of what is the theoretical optimum. So trials, I guess, are the acid tests that you have designed your amelioration strategy well, and will give confidence in future amelioration strategies. And trials, like any scientific experiment, should be designed to be statistically robust. You should have replicates that are meaningful in size, that don't have too much environmental variation, so they're not confounded in terms of the results that you're getting. But really valuable in I guess confirming successful mine strategy, and particularly if they can be done early, they can be used as a lead indicator in mine rehab. Yeah, I guess I think I've pretty much covered off on the importance and the sorts of things that might be assessed in terms of biomass and overall ecosystem health. So at that, we'll get back to the final session for questions and discussion.
Thank you, Glenn. That's great. We've got a few questions that are coming up, and we'd like to answer them all. So I think we might take a bit of a different strategy today, where I'll wrap up the presentation formally in a couple of minutes, and then we'll just hang around and answer a few of the other questions afterwards, if that's okay.
Perfect. Yeah, sounds good, Louisa.
Well, would you mind popping on the next slide, and then I'll just do that formal wrap up now, so that folks, if you need to leave at 11:30 because you have other commitments, thank you very much for your time. We do want to respect that and appreciate people are busy. This slide here I generated because everything that Glenn has presented today and Bernhard has included in the paper as well is really discussing the approach that we've presented in the paper. And the idea of having an approach is that it allows you to take each of those steps and consider your very specific site circumstances as you develop your growth medium. So that was what was quite important to us, to have that come out through the paper. And then there's just one other slide, Glenn, where we've got a QR code. And that's what's feedback on today's presentation. We really do appreciate everyone's feedback from previous workshops. It does help us to make sure that we improve these. There's 3 questions. One of them is multiple choice, so it's not hard to fill out. So we'll probably pop that slide back up later towards the end, but we'll just, now we can go back off to some questions. We've got a few questions here around the dispersivity issues that we have. And so the first question from Rebecca, I think I can sort of answer that essentially at the moment, because her question was, we have highly dispersive soils at our mines. How would you approach adding calcium to offset the sodium? A step-by-step guide. And then I'll answer that in saying, Rebecca, we put quite a detailed discussion about this in paper, including an example of one of the equations that are available to help you calculate your gypsum application rates. There's quite a bit of conversation and discussion in the paper about that. The second part of Rebecca, and sorry, that's in a later section of the paper, you'll find towards the end of the document. Rebecca's second part to her question also sort of marries in with another question. So Rebecca asked also, is calcium the best offset for sodium, or is there some other chemical element best suited? And then we have another question. Magnesium levels are often neglected in dispersive soils. Can you comment on the importance of including magnesium as part of the cations balance to reduce dispersivity? So I'll just throw that back to you, Glenn.
Sure, Louisa. Yeah. Obviously, calcium and magnesium both divalent cations. Sodium and potassium are monovalent. ESP is not normally calculated simply as the ratio of calcium to magnesium. There is a different metric that's used called cross-cation ratio of soil stability, I think it is, which actually doesn't give you significantly different answers, but it's more instructive. It recognises that sodium is more dispersive than potassium, which is more dispersive again than magnesium and calcium. So there is a gradient there between their dispersivity and their effect on stability. If if we could ameliorate soil with trivalent cations, and there's a whole raft of options there, that they're actually more effective again in stabilizing dispersive soils. But one of the great benefits of calcium is it's a really important and often undervalued nutrient, and some of the trivalent cations or aluminium will create toxic problems. High aluminium soils are often very stable; they're just toxic. In terms of magnesium, I didn't talk about it in the discussion, but obviously getting the calcium-magnesium ratio right as well. So it's one of those other interactions that shouldn't be ignored in your amelioration design.
And I remember learning many years ago that, you've got to have those things in the right balance, haven't you? Because too much magnesium can make, from memory, a very blocky soil, which is hard to wasn't really very appropriate in its structure. We have another question, but before that, I just wanted to let everyone know, if you haven't noticed, Glenn had talked about a few key texts throughout his presentation this morning, and we've put links to those. They're basically a part of a CSIRO series of textbooks that are quite recognised in Australia around soil. And so we've put links to the two that you mentioned, Glenn, and I threw a third one in just for free money, which is the yellow survey handbook, which I've used a bit over the years.
Yeah, the yellow book, the red book.
That's right. So there's links to those in the Q&A chat as well. So just for those who haven't not noticed. Another question, how do we best translate to mining engineers and accountants that poor soil management or restoration presents as a risk, cost or liability? What examples have you seen?
Yeah, it's a really good question as well, and the liability, and I guess it's should in theory be partly addressed by the requirement for progressive rehab, but the liability of getting 20 years, and I'm sure everyone's familiar, there are plenty of sites like this that are 20 years down the track, and you can drop a couple of buses into just individual parts of erosion and a couple of skyscrapers into erosion on some sites, which really create a very massive liability for rehab. So for future rehab, I guess one of the things we probably haven't really progressed to is distinguishing between rehabilitation and relinquishment, and it's I guess we've and again, this is part of the ACARP work that we did, was create a model that looks at the relatively small additional cost up front of ameliorating correctly versus the liability that it creates a longer term. And so it's very easy to do a discounted cash flow on that. And the longer it takes to get to that point of relinquishment, potential for relinquishment, the cost of holding that land in mine tenure, just keeps compounding. It's like compound interest. So every site is going to be different, but a discounted cash flow approach is really the way to be able to demonstrate that a small additional investment at the front pays financial dividends of rehabilitating a failed site in the future.
I have a little thing to add there as well, which is that we recently were speaking with some people at a metalliferous mine who had trouble with a trial that they were running, and then when they did the trial again a second time, they made it really front and center to all the different operational teams in parts of the mining business about the trial and the importance of it and how it was going. And they got a lot of success out of that, because they would go and present to different team meetings for those parts of the business. They had a chart in a common area that was tracking the progress of the trial and the things that they were learning and the benefits. And so they really brought those parts of the business along as well, because it seems to me that sometimes these things that we do as environmental folks happen a little bit in a silo. So if that helps as well, maybe to just really work hard at engaging with those other parts of the mining operation.
Yeah, then that's certainly where trials can be valuable as well. And I guess probably just to add to that point, designing based on the characteristics can actually be cheaper. The most the highest return is doing good spatially representative soil analysis. It's the most important investment. So again, coming back to those trials I showed right at the start, not only did we achieve actually much lower erosion on the rehabilitated sites relative to rock mulching, substantially cheaper to implement that rehabilitation strategy. I guess I've seen examples where people have applied a recipe approach where they've effectively taken the worst soil sample and applied gypsum over the entire area at that rate, and there has been potential to save an enormous cost in gypsum by applying it at the rate that's required. So moving away from blanket recipe applications to and the same is true in precision agriculture. It's a similar principle.
Okay, we have a couple more just to wrap up the morning. So thank you for those who are able to stay on with us. If mines are meeting all slope, ameliorate and vegetative milestones that are required to meet stable landform, how can we combat settling and swelling of soils that lead to erosion? Happy to read that again.
Yeah, if I got the question right.
So Assuming that
yeah.
the mine is meeting all the slope, amelia, and vegetative milestones necessary to, achieve a stable landform, how can we combat settling and swelling of soils that lead to erosion?
I guess if you're achieving your amelioration strategy correctly, then we should be avoiding those problems in the first place. Obviously, settling is, and I guess this is probably it's an important part of mine rehab design. And I guess what we haven't talked about in here is what we're really discussing in this paper is what do you do with the last 1.5 to 2 meters of material that goes on top of the rehabilitated landform. So, landform evolution modelling is really important in terms of design of the landform in the first place, and construction of that. That's the underlying foundation that may or may not affect, particularly settling over time. So maybe to answer it another way, in any large area rehabilitation project, whether it's mining, it's alluvial gullies or anything, an important part is ongoing monitoring as well. So you'll never get 100% of the area 100% right, and because we have, the tools are available now to get away from the old approach of doing a couple of transects that give you about this much visibility on how your site's performing, and it's possible to run LiDAR over the entire area and monitor quite regularly. And so early intervention, again, it comes back to that financial question, early intervention or early identification, monitoring, early identification, early remediation of those bits of a site that don't, you may have issues through settling, through swelling, through haven't quite been implemented properly in the design, weren't quite representative of the amelioration strategy, whatever it might be, is pretty important. And I guess our experience is it's you might get 90% right in the first year, and you fix up the little bit that you don't get right, and then in the next year there's a much smaller bit that hasn't. So pretty quickly you've addressed the whole area.
Thank you. That's a tough one to answer because there's so many different aspects to that, isn't there? So thank you for that question, but we'll keep moving on. We've got 3 more to answer, and then we'll be able to wrap up for the day. Does sheeting a sand layer before topsoil placement help in plant growth? I've never heard of that before.
Sheeting a what, sorry?
A sand layer.
Yeah. Interesting idea. I guess you, yeah, a common practice had been putting topsoil on to spoil and then ripping everything to try to notionally key the topsoil in, and you definitely, I guess, don't want to create a beautifully graded and smoothed spoil landform and put topsoil on that, which increases the risk of slippage. So yeah, I think the answer to that is really what you're aiming for is and while a beautifully graded spoil layer might look really good, and and look very engineered, to in addition to being smooth and increasing the risk of topsoil slippage. In the process, it's also likely to be more heavily compacted. So you're creating a layer where you may have restricted water infiltration that it just further exaggerates that risk of loss of topsoil. So it's probably a case of ugly is beautiful.
Okay.
Yeah, creating a rough topsoil, and I guess it's something we didn't talk about, which is once the topsoil is gone on, it's both very difficult to ameliorate the subsoil, and any incorporation into the spoil is likely to bring up rocks and bring up more sodic material. So, I guess our recommended strategy is when the spoil has been placed, to rip the ameliorants into that to at least 50 centimeters, create that rough layer, reduce compaction and bulk density, and then apply topsoil to that rough layer, which effectively, if you're putting on topsoil, then you're getting another 10 or 20 centimeters. So effectively, you've got a treated depth of 60 or 70 centimeters. So trying to maximise that treated depth is important in the process.
Thank you. The last two questions are about organic amendments, and we did touch on these in the paper as well. So Johan has a question: the use of biochar as part of soil amelioration, with a question. So should we? And then we can move on to the other question after that.
Yeah. Your biochar has some useful properties, and Johannes, I assume it's Johannes Biala.
No.
No, okay. Useful properties, but it is a biologically inactive form of carbon. So it will improve soil structure, it will improve water holding. And there's some interesting work to show that by sequestering root exudates that mineralize organic labile forms of organic carbon, it can actually help build organic carbon over time. Per se, it's not an available energy source for plant microbes, so it doesn't contribute to kickstarting the microbial system in the soil. So it has a place, and some work being done on using biochar as a carrier for nutrients, because it can help with slow release of nutrients into the soil, reduce losses. But again, it's understanding what function you're trying to achieve. And I guess, we haven't seen large-scale application of biochar in either agriculture or mine rehab. It definitely has a function in high-performance soil, so things like street trees in Brisbane that effectively live in a pot.
Yes.
You need a really high performance, high functioning soil in those situations, and it's a great application.
Okay, well that's lovely. That's a good conversation, because biochar is obviously something people are quite interested in and emerging. Last question: wood chips. This was interesting and not what I was expecting. When the wood chips break down and steals the soil nitrogen, I suppose the question is, when the process is complete, is the nitrogen released back into the soil? Does the nitrogen become available at a later date, essentially?
It will do, and because that's the plus side, and it's a reflection of the composting process. I guess if anyone's familiar with composting, you take organic matter, it goes from effectively, and the standard talks about this, going from mulch to immature compost to mature compost, and that's the point where that carbon nitrogen ratio is back in the Goldilocks zone. But it can also, and I guess again, this is where it's more complex than rocket science. Under stress conditions, or you can have different outcomes under drought conditions and in high rainfall conditions. So under high rainfall conditions, microbes in the soil are trying to do all they can, so they really will be mopping up all the nitrogen they can to break down woody matter. Under drought conditions, they're not as active, and it's not necessarily such a problem. Yes, there's actually quite a good paper on that by Natasha Banning from a couple of years ago in WA. I can't remember the exact date of that, but it's worth having a look at that paper, which explains that really well.
Thank you. Okay, well, thanks everybody. We went 15 minutes over, but we had a lovely conversation there. Thank you for all those questions that were very thought-provoking. I really just want to take the opportunity to say thank you to Glenn and thank you to Bernhard for preparing the paper and for spending the time to present today. Sam, I see, has put a link to the QMR feedback code that we put up earlier. So we really do appreciate your feedback. However you want to reach out to us, that's fine. But I'll close off and say thanks to everyone, and we'll see you at the next QMRC event sometime in the future. We'll advertise that through the normal channels. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks everyone. Bye.